What first crosses your mind when the topic of politics comes up? A grand, noble expression of society's collective will? Necessary evil? Frustration and dysfunction? Whatever your perspective, I think it's easy to lose sight of just how far we've come. The majority of people who have ever lived did so in societies that didn't even have a government we'd recognize as such. I invite you to consider with me what happened when societies began to organize themselves at scale, the ways in which that process changed the world for better and for worse, and perhaps some perspectives that we can gain from this understanding. If you've watched the video on the first wave Neolithic or agricultural revolution, then you'll be familiar with this map which shows the origins and spread of agriculture throughout the world. Beginning in the 4th millennium BCE, 4 larger civilizations arose that are generally considered the most impactful in the ancient world: Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus River Valley, and later in China. If anyone wants a deeper dive into those societies, check out the links in the description below. But for my purposes here, I'm going to be more focused on the general picture of these developments than the specifics of who accomplished what and when. It's clear quite quickly these are a lot of the same locations where agriculture first developed, and for the same reason. They've been called the River Valley civilizations because they're all situated on major rivers. Another factor is the climatic zone that they are in, specifically relative to the equator. All 4 are in the northern subtropical zone. Of course, there is very little landmass south of the tropics. Correlation certainly does not equal causation, but there's every reason to believe these 2 factors are actually extremely important. One key distinction between living along a riverbank as opposed to a coastline is that major rivers will regularly flood, times of heavy rainfall, snow melting, etc. In this way, there's a natural irrigation process of the low-lying areas around the river, facilitating optimal farming conditions. Meanwhile, in tropical climates, the soils tend to be very nutrient poor and do not support agriculture nearly as well. The temperate zones further from the equator are of course quite suitable for cultivation as well, and agriculture did eventually develop in these areas. But another partial explanation for why larger societies didn't grow in those areas initially is simply population density. Since in general agriculture was first developed in the early stages of the Holocene, concentrations of not just people, but just as importantly the animals they relied on for food were much greater near the equator, where at that time the temperatures would have been much milder. Combining then all these factors together, we can get a clear picture of the situation. Major river systems in the subtropical zones were literally the best place on Earth for a culture to thrive and prosper. That's about as far as I'm willing to go, however, when it comes to global generalizations. Even broad concepts like the Bronze Age, which I admit I've used too freely in the past, can really distort the picture. Consider Mesopotamia, where we get much of our conceptualization of ancient history from. The saying goes that you should emphasize the mess in Mesopotamia, since from the time the Sumerians first settled there, it's been a virtually unbroken record of conflict between one faction or another. The traditional model of the city-state emerges, in which once a population reaches a certain point in an area, they unite under a strong man, a dictatorial or authoritarian king. They then expand to the surrounding area, usually enslaving and conquering smaller settlements, and eventually wars emerge between rival city-states. If one city-state grows strong enough to conquer several of its neighbors, you have a much larger political and military force, an empire if you will, such as what is generally, in my opinion, inaccurately considered the First Empire under Sargon of Akkad or Sargon the Great around 2300 BC. Mesopotamian history is definitely notable for the level of churn, empires rising and then falling to be replaced by another and another, Akkadians, Assyrians, Babylonians. Just a cursory examination of it can give you a headache. One theory posited as an explanation for this upheaval in Mesopotamia from time to time has been simply environmental conditions, specifically relating to the rivers. Sparse rainfall in some parts of the region and generally unpredictable flooding patterns could have contributed to a chaotic outlook on life. This perhaps is reflected in the more capricious view they have of their pantheon. By contrast, in Egypt, the Nile was calmer and more predictable, irrigation didn't require nearly as much effort, and in general a more positive outlook was adopted. Developing a causal principle, though, based on a single-factor analysis, limited sample size, is always a bad idea, and we can see this in comparison to the Yellow River in China. There you find frequent devastating floods and course changes. In other words, the rivers behaved even more badly than did the Tigris and Euphrates. And yet you don't see that same level of internal conflict in ancient China. Another useful point of comparison is the approach various cultures took to construction. Similarities between the ziggurats in Mesopotamia, the pyramids in Egypt are quite apparent. Pyramids, of course, also appear in the Western Hemisphere. And while the purpose does vary some from place to place, this seems to be a very common thread. There are plenty of exceptions here as well, though, including the mysterious and largest of the river valley civilizations along the Indus. Their cities exemplify a striking uniformity of craftsmanship and a grid-based urban design. This suggests very strongly that early on a stable central government was established, in contrast to the model of traditional multiple warring city-states. Certainly they had no lack of engineering skill either. The drainage systems they employed included functional toilets and were far ahead of their time. They would not be equaled again for thousands of years until the Romans. Even with all these stunning accomplishments, however, they did not build any conventional megastructures. The largest structures we've uncovered were the great baths in the major cities, which undoubtedly served some sort of religious or ceremonial purpose, but they do not even begin to approach the scale of a ziggurat or pyramid. It would be ridiculous to do the most cursory overview of construction in the ancient world without mentioning the Great Wall of China. It truly is a remarkable achievement by any measure. In terms of temples or other buildings of cultural or religious significance, though, China had its own unique architectural style, and it was mostly based on the concept of feng shui. The orientation, placement, and even the time in which something was built was most important. In a similar manner, most Bronze Age distinctives, if not all of them, vary greatly based on what part of the world you're talking about. For the Near East or Europe, it can be a very useful concept. Venture further into Asia, though, the picture is much different. In other parts of the world, it simply does not fit at all. We still do not know nearly enough about developments in sub-Saharan Africa, but what we do know indicates that in some cases they invented copper and iron simultaneously, in others they went straight from copper to iron. There's really no Bronze Age at all. In the Americas, bronze is present, but all of the metals, for thousands of years, were used for more ceremonial or decorative purposes rather than as weapons of war or practical tools. So any type of broad, sweeping, general categorization of world history during this time just really seems to be inappropriate. Not only did different regions of the world follow diverging development paths, but there's also quite a bit of variation even within a single region. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a group of poems that are collectively considered probably the oldest surviving great work of literature. They date to as early as 2100 BC, detailing events from several hundred years prior, and one of the stories in the Epic of Gilgamesh is, I think, quite instructive in terms of humanity's struggle to learn how to govern ourselves better. For my purposes here, we'll call this the Tale of Two Kings. How much of this is actual history and how much is mythological is questionable and highly debatable. It's the ideas and concepts presented, though, not whether or not this actually happened, that's important. The two kings are Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, and Ega, king of Kish, two well-known ancient Mesopotamian cities. In classic hero's journey style, Gilgamesh does not start out on top of this particular comparison. Uruk is actually a subject or a vassal of Kish. And King Ega has a problem. He has some irrigation that needs to be done, and he does not have enough workers to do it. So Ega sends a message over to Gilgamesh at Uruk, telling him he needs some of Gilgamesh's workers. And this is not the if you feel like it kind of request. Uruk is obligated, and if they don't comply, then hostilities are certain to occur. For his part, Gilgamesh quickly realizes the implications of this demand. This isn't an issue of temporary help or some short-term loan. Digging canals and irrigation ditches by hand is long and very difficult work. It's going to require a large labor force, and then it's going to need to be maintained over time. We're talking about an extended period of slavery. Gilgamesh wants to turn Ega down and risk a war, but we see right away that his power in Uruk is not unlimited. If it was, he'd just tell Ega to go fly a kite, and that's the end of it. Instead, he presents the issue before an assembly of city elders. Gilgamesh wants their approval in refusing Ega's demand, but they don't agree with him. The elders say, no, you'd better do what he says. Gilgamesh isn't willing to do that either. He doesn't take the elders seriously. He just gathers a second, larger assembly of the fighting men. He puts the same issue before them, and they're much more enthusiastic. They tell him to go for it. And with the support of this second assembly, Gilgamesh sends back a message to Ega. We're not doing your work for you. Predictably, Aga attacks, and Gilgamesh and Uruk are victorious, and they essentially gain their independence from the dominance of Kish. Certainly, there are many parallels we could draw between this story and our modern international relations, political arrangements, all of that. But the main point is we're at the period of time when empires are first beginning to emerge. And already people are wrestling with the early seeds of what you might call primitive democracy, checks and balances. How do we give the state, the government, enough power to do what it needs to do? Managing trade, relations with other empires and city-states, justice and prosperity for the common man. On and on you could go with this. And still keep that power from being corrupted beyond control. It's the same kind of questions we are still wrestling with today. As the sage has written, there is nothing new under the sun. Going forward, we'll be focusing in on the two most enduring river valley civilizations, Egypt and China, doing a compare and contrast. But here I'd like to focus in on one fundamental question. Is history inevitable? How much control did people in ages past have over their destiny? How much control do we have of ours? Or are we simply being carried along by forces totally beyond our control? This map is from somewhat later in history than the period we've been mostly examining. It's about 1000 BCE. The color coding here differentiates between various types of societies. In the blue are those generally considered to have developed enough to have their own state or government. The orange areas denote advanced agricultural societies, green for simple agricultural societies, yellow for hunter-gatherers, and then in the Sahara and Arabian area you've got the purple for pastoral nomads, which is sort of a fifth category. At the beginning of the video, we saw the establishment of the River Valley civilizations 2,000 to 3,000 years before this, and there's been a definite shift. The great majority of the world's most advanced cultures now exist in the ancient Near East, and more broadly in and around Europe. There are some very interesting what-ifs to explore as a bit of a thought exercise here. What if humanity didn't get a late start in the Americas, migrating there only after being well established in the Old World? Notably absent here is the Indus River Valley culture, which we believe disappeared due to some sort of calamitous ecological shift, perhaps a drying up of the rivers. If those events had transpired differently, how might they have further developed and expanded their influence? This gets back to the question of inevitability. There are simply forces beyond our control. Some of them can't be predicted. On the other hand, as we look at other cultures around the world, those still existing as foragers or hunter-gatherers, for example, history is passing them by to a degree here in terms of influence on future world events. But that isn't to make a value judgment about them or their way of life. It's simply that people living in other places in the world had more opportunities. At the same time, we have seen that cultures, even in similar situations, sometimes took radically different paths. So I find myself in a state of tension between those two extremes. You have the foolish sayings like, "You can do whatever you want as long as you put your mind to it." We think about that, we all know it isn't true. Everybody has limitations based on their talents, their personality, their circumstances, any number of other factors. But at the same time, nobody should resign themselves to futility either. Every once in a while we'll discover that something we did months or years ago had a significant impact on somebody for better or worse. But for every time we actually get to know that, there's a whole bunch of other times that happened that you'll never know about. I think it's useful as an analogy to consider all of humanity, or even beyond that, all of reality itself, as a massive puzzle. And within that, any particular culture, any particular historical society, historical figure, ourselves, fit in as an individual piece. There's a number of ways in which we can do that. We can generally remain disconnected and isolated and not contribute at all. We can generally cause chaos by attaching wherever we feel like in the puzzle, thinking only about where we feel to go and not the broader picture. We can intentionally sabotage some part of the puzzle that just doesn't sit right with us. We can also attempt to fit into place as purposefully and positively as we can and find harmony within the greater structure. Whatever path we might choose from these or other options will have a significant impact on the greater tapestry. And I think particularly in the modern world it's common to underestimate that impact. I also very much believe that when looking at history it's important to make it as personal as you can, not just view it from a distance as though we are somehow above or superior or more enlightened. It can be very tempting to look at some events and say we would never be as cruel, as territorial, as violent, as divisive, whatever the case may be. But what we know about ourselves as human beings is that there is a tremendous collective pressure on how we behave. Exactly why that is may not be entirely clear, but it's obviously a powerful impact. I think that sort of corporate dynamic also goes a long way towards explaining some of the distinctions between various cultures. As always, I place the highest respect and value on your feedback and thoughts. Feel free to fire away in the comments below. And that's especially true of the HP series. When we return, we'll be diving into ancient China. Till then, thanks for watching, everybody.